Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition. I bet you weren't expecting to come this fast and furious of not quite the witching hour with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan, who's here to help guide myself as well as you through the strangeness and interesting and also glorious opportunities of this culture war that's unfolding as we speak, as we reach the end of an epoch, era, Aeon, Yuga, and a new cycle is beginning. And we have a front row seat to the fascinating changes, opportunities, and absurdities in the world. And oh boy, what I see an absurdity today in today's Irish newspapers are full of stories of Americans who are fleeing to Ireland to escape Trump. And the way that it's absolutely preposterous and hysterical. The way they're talking, you would think they were escaping like a really brutal Islamic regime or something like that. And they're the classic namby-pamby, sort of like soy boy husband and sort of like unhinged borderline wife uh, who want to come to Ireland to flee Trump because they're afraid of their lives and saying things like, we're fighters, but we have to retreat for a while. And lots of them all saying, we really didn't think Trump would win. So they're actually like the Irish government. Uh, it's just, these people are beyond pathetic. They need to do some more traveling if they want to see what a real totalitarian nation looks like. I can assure you it won't be the United States under Trump. And in many ways, these people are, when you think about it, they're seeking a totalitarian state where you have people shut down for what they call hate speech, which is no such thing as hate speech. There is a hate crime, but there's no such thing as hate speech. There's just speech. That's all. Okay. Whether you find it offensive or not, that's purely subjective. Now, what do we need is human decency so people don't do say hateful things. Well, don't say nasty things or slurs and things like that, and are considerate of others, but that's not hate speech. Now, that's not what today's story is about. In fact, some of you might find this hate speech, but I can assure you it's not. Today's show is about Christianity and issues I have with it. Okay. Now, I've been accused on comments in the past of suffering from Jesus Christ derangement syndrome. And I thought that was very funny, but I really don't, because Trump derangement syndrome is based on irrational fears. It's my Jesus Christ derangement syndrome is not irrational fears. My Jesus Christ derangement syndrome, if you want to call it that, is not based on irrational fears. It's based on something that most Christians don't have, and that's education about their own religion. Now, I'm going to get people saying, and first of all, I want to say, I'm not doing this to hurt anyone's feelings, okay? I'm not doing this to challenge anyone's beliefs or say, I take your faith away from you. What your religious faith is and what your beliefs are is your own business and nothing to do with me. I'm responding to something. I'm responding to something that I want to talk about because I feel it's important. Now, I wasn't molested by a priest or anything like that growing up. I didn't really have a religious upbringing as such. My parents didn't force me to go to mass or anything like that. Although I was raised, raised when I say I was born into a Roman Catholic tradition, and I have made my first Holy Communion and confirmation and all that. But by the time I was 12, I saw right through it and I wasn't interested. Now, before you say Catholicism is not real Christianity. Well, no, real Christianity is Judaism. So you don't even have the high ground on that one. Now, why I'm doing this is not out of spite. It's not to be edgy. It's not to be controversial. It's not to be a pagan evangelist, if such a thing is possible. It's to address something I'm seeing which I do not like. And what I don't like is I've heard it expressed by people like Jordan Peterson. I've heard it expressed by Tucker Carlson, and I've heard it expressed by others that Western civilization is Judeo-Christian. Western Jewish civilization is pagan. And I'm going to prove that to you over the course of this show. And it is absolutely not a Judeo-Christian invention. And when Christians cite Christianity as what made the West, that the great invention of the West, of Christianity, was the West. It's one of the most appalling lies that's ever been created. The West is exclusively, I'm not saying even primarily, it's exclusively a product of classical paganism. And there's also some Nordic and Celtic and other Germanic and Iberian and Slavic paganism that added to that as well. And sure, there was some Christian philosophers and thought along the way. And there was also Jewish ones. There was like Spinoza and people like that. But it is a pagan, pagan foundation. And these people talk about the West as if Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, Hypatia, Socrates, Archimedes, and all the rest of them were somehow honorary Christians. And they never actually stopped for a second and said that these people were absolutely pagans. And they gave you your Western civilization. And then they will cite things like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. No, the Renaissance was the Renaissance of classical pagan Europe. They started digging up all these statues out of the ground, and they were saying like, how were we so advanced 2,000 years ago? Well, because the Christians smashed all the pagan statues up and destroyed pagan culture. That's why. And now the Renaissance, as you wrote, means you literally the Renaissance, the revival of the pagan world. And then they might cite the Protestant Enlightenment, yeah, with its neoclassical architecture and its neoclassical thought processes and the whole things, even things like the Christian superstars of the Enlightenment, such as Edmund Burke, an Irishman. He he was very much in the Marcus Aurelius, you know, world of coming out of that classical pagan world, and even other like Christian era philosophers that I'm quite drawn to, like Montaigne, Michel Montaigne. Is his writing is very pagan-esque in how it's approached. So I want to talk about that and say, look, Tucker Carlson, okay, I respect what you do, but you're wrong about this, and you're being very disrespectful to Europeans. And I really don't have a lot of time for Jordan Peterson. And he went on and claimed that European civilization doesn't exist. In fact, he was talking very much like those types, those shit lib types in America, those lefties who say, "What white culture? What you're white? You don't have a freaking culture." He was talking very much in those ways by saying Europeans don't have a culture. It all comes from the Middle East. Absolute nonsense. A so-called scholar, a so-called great mind, when he's not crying his eyes out, he's sounding like one of those sort of like anti-European, Afrocentric shit libs, not even that Afro, like, oh, you know, anti-Eurocentric shit libs. And so this is important. And those of you, I know a lot of my audience are on the middle ground, tend to be, but generally there's a lot of people who be from a conservative bent. And I would like you to sort of like challenge when Christians come along with this like thing of like, well, European and Western society is a product of Judeo-Christianity. I want you to cite this video as proof that it isn't. In fact, to even put the Judeo part in it is really outrageous because Judaism had almost no role to play in Western civilization outside probably communism. And I'm not saying that in a slur or anything like that. But if you think of the largest the largest philosophical element of Western civilization that had the greatest impact and all for the bad was Marxism. It's as simple as that. It was, Marx and Engels. And you can write that any way you want. And I'm not using that to put down Jews or anything, because I know a lot of Jews are not like that. But I'm just saying that's it. Other than that, there isn't much else. In fact, you could actually even go as far as and say it's an Islamo-Christian, because an awful lot, not an awful lot, but the Islam actually helped create a mini enlightenment in the fourth, fifth, and say in the sixth, seventh centuries, particularly in Iberia. But they originally had gotten that from pagans. It was because when the Christians destroyed the classical pagan world, the what was left of the Greek symposiums and classical learning, the 30% that hadn't been destroyed by the Christians, iconoclasts who destroyed 70% of classical Europe, literature, art, science, you name it, had fled to Persia, and they found in Persia that a sympathetic Persian, highly enlightened pagan culture, pre-Islam, remember, and a kind of a mini Renaissance swept through the Islamic world after they basically discovered the learnings of the classical world. Now, here in Ireland, we're told there's nonsense put around how the Irish saved civilization. The Irish didn't save civilization. They saved the first four books of the Torah. If you look at what was saved by Irish monks, it was exclusively all Jewish. It was all religion. It was all, it was all like the bloodline of Jesus Christ going back to King David. It was things like that in the Book of Kells. The rest there was no science in it. But who really saved that was the Persians. It really should be how the Persians saved civilization, because the classical world's greatness fled to, following the iconoclastic Christian takeover of Europe. Now we're going to dive into some history here, and again, people like I've been talking to Christian people about this, and I'm always respectful. I'm never shouting them down or making fun of them, and they will say, "Well, that's your opinion." I says, "No, it's not my opinion. This is history. This happened. Christianity is opinion because Jesus Christ is a fictional figure, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, let's go back to the time when Christianity began. There was great schisms in Judea, in the ancient what they call the Holy Land, and basically it was a conflict within Judaism at the time, where Judaism had because the Romans were so tolerant, like all pagan societies are tolerant. They don't oppress people over religion. If you don't pay your bills and you try to start an army, they'll come down on you. But otherwise, you're free to worship what you want. And Judaism in Judea had flourished under the Romans, and they had a very good working relationship with the Roman Empire. Now, of course, there would have been Jewish people at the time, Jewish individuals who felt like, well, we're not, this is, Herod and the rest of them. This is just a vassal government of Rome. We're not really independent. We're not a real people here. We're basically just Romans conquered by the Romans. And of course, like many other places, from Germany to Britain to Spain, or everywhere else, there was movements to break away from the Roman Empire. And this was the roots of zealotry. Now, zealotry was they were basically Jewish fanatics who felt that it was actually against God's law, that Israel's covenant with God had actually been broken by the Roman occupation of Judea. Theologically speaking, that's correct, but it actually, that's actually true. But at the same time, too, Judea had flourished under Roman rule, and that's what the whole thing of like the legend of Jesus overturning the tables of the money lenders in the temple. It was basically a way of saying like, the mainstream Orthodox Judaism within Judea had sold itself out to the Romans. And much the same way, like in Ireland today, you might have the schism about the European Union. You're not really Irish, but we're not really Ireland. We're not a free country if we're in the European Union. Technically, it's true, but life being what it is, there are complications in terms of, well, the economy of Judea had been raised. It was actually a tremendous exporting area at the time. So anyway, these highly Orthodox Jewish radicals called zealots took it upon themselves to try and liberate Judea from the Roman occupation. This is what they were the ones who founded Christianity. Now, then you hear there's sort of like the New Age Christians talking about how Jesus, that is nonsense, how Jesus lived in India and he studied Buddhism and all this crap. And then and invariably it brings you back to the Essenes. Now, the Essenes were a kind of crypto Gnostic group, and Jesus was an Essene, and he practiced meditation and he wrote about peace and everything. Firstly, we don't know an awful lot about the Essenes at Qumran. And what we do know about them predominantly comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention anything about Jesus Christ. No document does, or any of them. There is a fleeting reference to possibly someone called Andrew, translated into our language, that may have that they're claiming was a relation of Jesus, the proof that Jesus exists. He didn't exist. He's a completely fictional character. Well, he's an amalgamation, really. So, and again, why should this affect you in any way? Now, how this all came into my own being was when I was very young. I read The Fall and Decline of the American Empire by Gore Vidal. Gore Vidal, who was the American sort of like intellectual and screenwriter. He wrote Ben-Hur, and he mentioned early on in the book. It's really a booklet. It's more like an extended essay. If you can get your hands on it, get it. It's very good. It's a very good analysis of how the United States was demolished by what we now call the deep state. And it was written back in the 70s, I think. But Gore Vidal points out that the greatest catastrophe that ever befell the West was monotheism, the Abrahamic triad of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. They weren't meant for the West. They were Eastern religions, and the European were polytheistic. They had belief in many gods. And when Constantine did this deliberately, but when they had moved over to Christianity and monotheism, Abrahamism as a whole, Gore Vidal makes out the point, and very succinctly, and it definitely impressed me as a teenager, or I was about in my early 20s maybe, that monotheism was a disaster for Europe and the West, because it opened the door to having one God, opened the door to having one emperor, one king, one law, one control system, which is globalism, folks. This is why I'm always saying that Christianity was the great one later on, or official Christianity was the Great Reset Part One under Constantine. So anyway, you had these zealots in Judea in the late, what we call now the late BC era. And we have, let's go to the synoptic gospels and we'll talk. And don't give me this whole thing about, oh, the gospel of St. Thomas or the gospel of Judas has the real story. No, they're basically the same. They don't give you, they're not great whistleblowing texts. That's a myth that like truthers and New Agers come out with. That, oh, the real stories in the gospel of St. Thomas, or the real stories in the gospel of Judas Iscariot and all this kind of thing, or the gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, to show you how interlinked the New World Order and Christianity is, there's even a subsect of the trans movement that believes that our claims that Jesus Christ was transgender, and the actual crucifixion was him becoming a woman and dead naming himself, and he came back as Mary Magdalene. And I mean, these people are actually serious. These people are actually serious. It's right there, the whole concept of the gay liberation thing in Italy during the 1970s, talked about the sex life of Jesus Christ, where Saint Peter and Jesus were gay lovers. I mean, this is Abraham stuff's great for the New World Order stuff, because it dovetails all their agendas in. And again, if you're a Christian, I'm not putting you down. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm just saying this is, the next time you hear someone say the West was created by Christianity, it wasn't. Absolutely was not. Now, Judeo-Christianity especially. Now, so anyway, these zealots, well, it all ties into the early stirrings of the Jewish revolt. Now, the Jewish revolt eventually became a pretty awful thing that led to the Romans having enough. And, you all know what happened when they basically destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and they killed, thousands and thousands of Jews, and Masada and all that stuff. It became, so the zealots back in, say, well, we're talking about the early AD, late BC period, were basically like ISIS. They were kind of like they were not driven primarily by political revolution, but by theological revolution. They literally felt that the rabbis in the temple and the rabbis dealing with Pontius Pilate and the Roman government, and also Herod and all that stuff, that they were literally Uncle Tom types, and but it was much worse than that. It went very deep because a covenant had, that with God had been broken. And this is a big deal, a really big deal. And so uh, we all hear about the story of Jesus Christ and the Messiah. And yes, there is a document that does reference around the time of Jesus Christ about trouble concerning a Jewish Messiah in Jerusalem. Now, but the thing is that there were loads of messiahs in Jerusalem back then. I mean, look it up. I mean, Catherine Nixie's books, and she's an Oxford scholar. She's certainly not someone who pulls it out of her arse. She's not a truther or anything like that. I mean, there were several. There was something like at the time of Jesus Christ, 11 to 40 messiahs operating in Jerusalem. It was just like any kind of sect, cult that they had people calling themselves Jerusalem. That's the funny thing, this thing Jerusalem syndrome. Like that when it only happens to Protestants for some reason. They go on holiday to Jerusalem, and after on the second day they think they're Jesus Christ. It's so bad that the Jerusalem Police Department actually have a guy who's devoted to helping these people. And I saw you an interview with he's probably not the same guy now, but back in the 90s, I saw an interview with this guy from the Jerusalem Police Department. He was hilarious. And he was saying, yeah, like every few weeks I'll have to like take some guy off the street who's walking around in a robe. He came over on a holiday and he got hit with Jerusalem syndrome and he thought he was Jesus Christ. And he goes, and I'll tell you something, and he said, and he was very funny. He said, I'll tell you something that's really funny. He goes, in all the years I've been doing this, there has never ever been one Catholic who thought he was Jesus Christ, only Protestants. And he goes, I don't know what that's about, but that's what it is. But before Jerusalem syndrome existed, in the modern sense, Jerusalem syndrome existed back then. And this is there was fellas going around thinking they were the Jewish Messiah, as outlined in Isaiah in the Old Testament in the Torah. And so that was not proof that was Jesus Christ. It was just proof that there was one more guy walking around calling himself the Messiah that would like liberate Israel from its occupation. See, this is why it's really bizarre. When these American Protestants who are like pro-Trumpers, pro-Republican, pro-conservatives are looking for the Messiah, they're actually looking for a guy to relieve them from their American government because they would be in the same lineage as the original Roman government. But anyway, I digress. This is how crazy it all is. But anyway, so we know the famous story that on the weekend of the Passover, when this is not I'm not quoting history here. I'm quoting what was put together much later by theologians and basically and Roman bureaucrats mostly, and so that there was this guy called Barabbas led a riot at the same weekend that the Messiah Jesus Christ was crucified, and so this is when the stuff gets really interesting. There was a riot that weekend, and there's a lot of evidence that Barabbas did exist. He probably was a real person. And he did lead a revolt in Jerusalem on the Passover. But however, what makes it really interesting, and then when all this shit happened, we know the story. The rabbis in Jerusalem blamed this fictional Jesus Christ character, and Pontius Pilate said, like, I wash my hands with it. It's what you want. If he's the one you say caused all the trouble, it's your call, not mine. And this is where the kind of like anti-Semitic thing of blaming the Jews for killing Christ comes from. So anyway, uh, it's probably likely there was a book written in the 70s called The Passover Plot, and the Passover Plot was written by a guy called Hugh Schoenfeld, I think his name was. And I read it when it came out, and it's a very interesting read. In fact, a lot of things that's come about ever since, like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and all that stuff, this probably has a bit more than a bit of a homage to this book. Well, the Passover Plot basically said that Barabbas was probably Jesus Christ. He kind of hints at but I think it's quite plausible. And this whole story of that revolt, that uprising that happened at Passover in Jerusalem, that the whole crucifixion thing was basically set up as a kind of a distraction, a a public performance, almost kind of like similar, nowadays the way we talk about nonlinear warfare and how they put, you look at they put out absurdities to kind of destroy your mind, to stop you from thinking straight. Well, the Passover plot was something like that. It was basically a kind of an Edward Bernays type nonlinear warfare thing to create a false messiah with the desire to create an uprising to free Judea. And Jan Stonefield does not believe in Jesus. He believes in an actor probably playing the part or someone hired to do it. But he says Joseph of Arimathea, who's often cited by British Israelites as having gone to England and this nonsense. And brought Jesus with him once, this whole British Israelism thing, and which is just like a Presbyterian cult. It's like literary Jerusalem syndrome. And it was really like that, the poem Jerusalem. It's a lovely song, the William Blake one. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain? It never happened. But it's a lovely song. I do like it a lot. But you'll see that constantly done through history, even Arthurian stuff and things like that. But anyway, the Passover plot basically opened my mind up that there's a lot, and it was difficult to get information on early Christianity back then when I was in, even right up into the 90s. It wasn't even like mainstream stuff. You'd really have to go to into like college libraries or university archives to find this stuff that's now, more in the open. But and there was also a lot of documentation that had not been translated into outside Latin or in Hebrew and Greek. A lot of it was written in Greek as well. So basically, it boils down to the fact that Jesus Christ never existed. There were multiple messiahs. There were lots of false starts and lots of imposters. And basically, the plot to overthrow Jerusalem, overthrow the Roman occupation of Judea, failed, and it was all tied up in that. And then it's hinted at in the story of Barabbas and all that stuff. It's hinted at all that stuff, and it's because basically the the people who put the Bible together had to skirt around fact and fiction to create this Jesus Christ character and make him real. Now that's part one of the story. Okay, that there was some kind of hullabaloo in Jerusalem around the early part of the late part of the BC era, late AD, in the decades leading up to early AD, in the decades leading up to the Jewish revolt proper. And that's part one. Now, part two is the part that's really interesting, is how that became Christianity. Now, you have Caesar's Messiah and those kinds of theories. And I think they also are kind of compatible with what I'm kind of laying out as well. And so I don't discount any of that stuff. That's definitely more real than the real story of Christianity. I'd be more along the lines of, well, what I'm going to lay out here, which is, I think there's just, as things stand, there's more evidence, shall we say, real evidence yet to actually sustain that than the Roman elites, specifically done in the kind of style of the Caesar's Messiah. That so so what we have that situation. So we have the situation where something happened in Judea. It led to the Jewish revolt, and the temple was raided, and a lot of the stuff was brought back to Rome. A lot of like the things like the menorah and stuff like that was brought back to Rome. Judaism was in a catastrophic state. They were scattered throughout the empire, and all roads lead to Rome. Now, so in the same way that during the Troubles in Ulster, London was full of the IRA, or like, now the West is full of Al Qaeda, well, not Al Qaeda, well, ISIS type cells. Jewish radicals started to migrate towards Rome proper from the fringes of the empire. In the years following the Jewish revolt, they basically went bonkers. They became very radicalized. And that schism I spoke earlier on about between the Orthodox old, say first temple, first temple Judaism, right? Became Second Temple rabbinical Judaism, which was became what we now know as Christianity. Now, this Second Temple rabbinical Judaism basically fermented in the deserts of Syria. It always comes back to the same places of the world. Now, they had tremendous hostility over what had happened in the Jewish revolt. Understandably, it was a kind of a minor genocide. And, well, it wasn't minor if you were one of the ones that were killed. And also, they wanted revenge on Rome, just like ISIS wants revenge on the great Satan, just like Hamas wants revenge on Israel and everyone else, and just like the IRA wanted revenge in the 70s on the British establishment. So the same thing happened. So they first made their sort of like proclamation to the world when they came out of the Syrian desert as the first Christians. These would have been people that were terrifying to mainstream Jews because they also saw mainstream Judaism, Orthodox Jews, as pre Second Temple rabbinical Jews, as being responsible for what the catastrophe that led to the aftermath of the Jewish revolt. So these guys started to make themselves to, move themselves. Now, this would have been around the time towards the end of the reign of the Emperor Claudius and coming into the reign of the Emperor Nero in Rome. Okay, so true, so you hear these stories about Pauline doctrine and St. Paul's journeys and all this, and the wandering tribes of Israel, and also things like the Book of Revelations. Now, the Book of Revelations was supposed to happen in the period that it's written. It wasn't supposed to happen now or in the future. The great beast 666 is the Emperor Nero, and 666 in Kabbalism represents the banking system that basically keeps everything in check. So it was kind of like the fleeting early signs of communism as well. Isn't that interesting? The bankings, and that was actually that's so when the mythology of Jesus Christ was later written, all this was amalgamated that I'm talking about now into the story. So they attacked the temple of Athena at Palmyra and the university. And this is like was the great center of learning of Greek classical learning, now under the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Empire. And from there, and then so basically they announced Christians exist, right? A second thing was they'd set fires, disenfranchised. Now remember, they were Jews. They did not call themselves Christians. They were Jews. They wanted to do what this Jesus Christ character were told to do, reform Judaism. So they were Jews, they were like basically very angry Jews who were angry at the old Jewish establishment, angry at the Roman Empire, and basically what they called, the Goyim or the outsiders. So they moved into Rome proper and they started things like arson attacks and so on like this. And this is why they destroyed some of the arson attacks were quite catastrophic in Rome, and they had led to mass persecutions by Nero, who said about, and this Nero was a guy who's very badly, not very badly, but they talk about he played the fiddle while Rome burned. Nero, there was the Christians, the Jews who burned Rome to the ground, and it was well these disenfranchised Jews, what the now being probably called Christians at the time, and they were or Messianic types or this kind of thing, and the Nero set about a phenomenal rebuilding process of Rome. And these stories of the poor, lovely Christians being thrown to the lions and being crucified and all this stuff. These were not. These were the ones who burned down Rome. They're being punished. They were caught and punished. They weren't like innocent like lambs. They were like terrorist cells who were just trying to destroy the Roman Empire from within. But then something remarkable happened later on. Constantine, who was dealing with his own stuff, the Emperor Constantine, who was dealing with his own stuff, came to the realization that the Roman Empire was fragmenting badly, which it did. We know happened eventually, and there was all kinds of factions, and there always was that kind of thing in Rome. There always was, and there was always kind of checks and balances. See my previous video about the Praetorian Guards and all this stuff, and he wanted to make the Roman army better, and how he decided to make it better was to make it more fanatical. Now, in the same way that Adolf Hitler taught that Islam was an ideal religion for the German soldier, look it up if you don't believe me. That's why he brought 80,000 Muslims into the Wehrmacht, including large numbers of Muslims into the SS. In the same way that he realized that this religion of Christianity would make soldiers who are not afraid of death, because there've been so many. If you read Catherine Nixby's The Darkening Age, you can read so many documents that were by magistrates who are trying to, like, including one very touching one where a Roman magistrate, after a Christian had insulted the emperor and vandalized the temple of Lupertor, the Roman magistrate went to and says, "Your 17-year-old son is he's just young and foolhardy. Just tell him to make a public apology and then make a sacrifice to the emperor." And the the governor was shocked to find out that the Christian mother was delighted her son did it, and she wanted him to be. It was just like Matthias Desmond's mass formation psychosis when he talks about it in terms of what happened in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. And she wanted him to die because he would go to heaven and they'd all be in heaven together. Now, this was happening all over the empire, that these Christians were involved in attacks on everything, mostly centers of learning, a lot of temples, and they were not afraid of dying because they believed that when they would die, they would go to live with Jesus in heaven. And so, what did Constantine do? That makes the perfect soldier, someone who's not afraid of dying. And so, even though he himself remained a pagan for the rest of his life, a story in mythology made up that he saw the pyro symbol at the Milburn Bridge, the Battle of the Milburn Bridge, and he converted to Christianity. No, he decided to make the Roman army Jewish. Now, prior to that, it had been monotheistically pagan, mostly following Mithra, and to a lesser extent, Mithra, which is a pagan god, and to a lesser extent, Baal, our friend Baal, we hear from, which was Baal was an Eastern and a North African fertility god. So basically, that's what he did. He basically said, "We're going to become Christians now," and that's why the birth date and all the paraphernalia and all the sort of like the details around Jesus Christ, the Son of a Virgin, raised from the dead, is all Mitra's story. They just dovetailed it in, and this was the beginning of what has to be the world we live in today, where the Roman Empire, being quite genius, I have to say, realized that how you really control a people is not through radicalization or revolution, but is through tiptoe amalgamating and assimilating, and what today we would call diversity, but it's really a bonding of all things under the same control system. And that's why I've referred to Christianity as the Great Reset Part 1. So anyway, by I think it was around 300 AD, the Roman Empire, and when Constantine died, his tomb is pagan. It has an image of him, a frieze, sacrificing a lamb to the temple of Lupertor, or it's either Lupertor and Apollo, I can't remember. But anyway, so over time, the Roman army became Jewish, what we call Christian, but it was Second Temple Rabbinical Judaism. The Roman establishment were like Scientologists today, among like all the hoi polloi and all the posh and everything become and Hollywood types become Scientologists. They became Christians. And so that's your cultural war right there. One, because you have the army who are the member of the same religion as the establishment, and then it's just a matter of putting in all the prohibitions, and boy did they, statutes, legal and other means to destroy the existing pagan religion. And Rome, both in its, East, old Roman Empire, then the East and the West, or the Julian part and the Western part, and then the later on the Holy Roman Empire and so on, the Vatican, went on basically, let me see, 1,000 year persecution and genocide against pagans, starting with classical pagans in Rome and in Greece, and working their way through Germanic and all the rest, big British, or Britons, and into the rest of the world, culminating in Europe with the Third Swedish Crusade against the Karelians, the pagan Karelians of Eastern Europe. It's in the Russian Finnish area, where the East Prussia, and where the story is that the Danish got their flag because after they killed the pagans, God dropped the Danish flag from heaven down upon the Danish army, and that's why that was the Third Swedish Crusade into East Prussia, and that really was like nearly the 1500s. That's how long the persecution went on, from about 300 AD, more than 1,000 years, like 1,200 years, and it was brutal and it was vicious. And if you don't believe me, there's an article on my website. I'll post it in the comments. You can actually go through it only gives a fraction of the persecution, but there was probably about 160 million pagans in Rome, in Europe at the time that Constantine came along, and by the time the Third Swedish Crusade happened, there were none left. And the ones that survived, they were called witchcrafts, or people who practiced the old faith, like Joan of Arc later on, which is another fascinating story we'll cover on this at one point. So it's one thing to have a statutory and a military Christianity now ruling the Roman Empire. How do you embellish, create, and manufacture the mythology, the actual text, the theology? Well, this was a case of basically what they did was, when they talk about, oh, there's loads of books of the Bible left out. The reason why many of them are left out is redundancy, because they kind of repeat what the other ones say. They were also they were like criminals trying to get their story right. When they asked us about this, you say we didn't. It was like that kind of thing. And so the synoptic gospels became key to this. But the synoptic gospels gave lots of hints to the real story, such as Jesus Christ mocking and laughing at the pagan woman who asked her to cure her and her sick child, and comparing her to a dog. And it's only when she accepts him as Messiah, Rabbi Messiah, that he then cures her. And then there's the other that mentioned the Barabbas and so on. And the synoptic gospels are filled with inconsistencies, which they would be, because none of them were written during the time of Jesus Christ. The first one, I think, was 70 years after the death of Jesus Christ, written by a physician or something like that, who was a physician to an early Christian, and so on. So they have to get the story straight. Now, you had the Augustinian thing to try and create this text. Now, the whole thing of the crucifix is nonsense, because the crucifix was a pagan symbol, absolutely 100%. It wasn't used in Christianity until about 1,000 AD, and well, not used in a regular sense. The symbol of Christianity was for many centuries was a fish, because you could the fisher of men, and you could spell the word Jesus in Greece would be spelled into the shape of a fish. So that was it. And also at the time of King Augustine, they thought it would be the keys from the pyro symbol would might make a thing. And St. Augustine also said the cockerel. The cockerel would be an ideal symbol of Christianity. And that's why the cockerel is used in French motif, a coq sportif, and came the cockerel as a symbol of France. It comes from early Christianity. And the cockerel would have been really offensive to the. Remember, they were still thinking of themselves as Jewish at this time. Remember that Christians until about, oh God, up to 1000 AD, maybe later on, near into the Middle Ages, were calling non-Christians Gentiles. They were Jews. They were Jews in more or less every way. Now, the first gathering of the Bible was done by Origen of Alexandria, and he put all the books together, and he put all the synoptic gospels together, and gave us what is basically the Catholic canon that we have today. Okay, and that was basically the first four, no, the first 5 or 6 books of the Torah, the Jewish holy book, the Old Testament, the Synoptic Gospels, and then things like the St. Paul's letters to the Romans and the other later. The books of Numbers, I think, is later too as well. But that was it. There was a, that was that. Then they had their book. They had their official holy book. Remember, people of books. Now this would have been really offensive to pagans because pagans didn't have a holy book. That's what distinguishes the Abrahamic religions, a book of rules. Even pagan religions like Hinduism doesn't have a book. People say the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, but they're not rule books. They're books of mythology. They're books of inspiring stories. They're not the law of God, right? No. Now, and so that's what happened there, and that's how Christianity became what it is. And so basically, it was Roman civilization with this Jewish religion tacked onto it. And that's where the Judeo-Christian thing came from. But the greatness of the West was exclusively pagan in every way, every way. And later on, when the Reformation came along and you had Martin Luther, now if you look at the schisms that led to the Reformation, they're kind of like a bit odd. There's things like the dating of Easter and also things that the Lutherans were correct about, such as plenary indulgences, like paying for the souls of the dead to get into heaven, and also other weird stuff like the nature of purgatory. But in reality, the combination of the Lutherans and the Calvinists, who created what was basically the framework for Presbyterianism, not Presbyterian, Protestantism that came afterwards, it was basically a belief that Catholicism was too pagan. Well, guess what? It was pagan, and that a Protestant religion was needed that had less iconography in it. So this is why they removed the holy pictures and the statues from the churches in exactly the same way that the early Christians removed the pagan gods from the temples all over Europe, not just in the Roman Empire, and so on. And the 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 prohibition. One of the first things they did in the Roman Empire was the prohibition on magic and the prohibition on fortune telling, the prohibition on any sorceries and necromancies and everything else like that. And this was central. Magic is central to paganism. That's one of the central tenets of all paganism. Remember, is magic, the belief that you can change reality through actual rituals and the thought processes and even artistic ways. And that's where witchcraft came from. They were groups within the Roman Empire who became witches, and they continued to practice the old religion. And you hear them saying, like, oh, they practice the old ways. It's not just that they were literally worshiping the old pagan gods, which they were sometimes. We see, we don't, like in a country like here in Ireland, we really don't know how Christianity came to take over Ireland and how long it took. St. Patrick is a complete and total fabrication. He was invented about 700 years after he existed by an Acronite bishop called Aid of Sletty, who hired a scribe to invent an Irish evangelist. But we don't know if he existed, and we just don't know. There's some, and even the Roman documentation of Ireland, it's all missing. So much of it's lost. So the way Ireland became Christianity was the Roman Empire took over, not in the same way it took over Britain. It was more of a business deal, something similar to the the European Union. And if a St. Patrick like creature, who said that, individual, oh yeah, well, individual existed, he more than likely would have been Henry Kissinger type individual who came in over with a box of money and an army and basically bought off some chieftains and kings and waged wars against the ones who are problematic, such as Lyra at Tara, hence Tara, hence his magical fire at Tara. If you read between the lines of all that stuff too, what you basically get is a war against the pagans. How long it took, we don't know. But like any Irish academic who talks about St. Patrick as a real person is shouldn't even be allowed to like, you know, have a say. And it's up there with all these British Israelite muppets like Jordan, what was his name? Jordan Maxwell saying that Abraham came from Brahman, and people like and all the idiots who recycled the Manly P. Hall thing that Era came from Aryan, like and when it came from the goddess Eru. I mean, I saw a thing where he had some guy was talking about that, and you know where else got its name Aryan? Ireland. And then all those Irish people were filling the comments saying, "You're joking. What are you on about? Ireland is named after the goddess Eru. Ireland, 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 Ireland." And when the Scandinavians came along, Ireland. And that's where it became the name country Ireland. They spelled it Irlund, Ireland. And Ireland, Ireland, like England was Angleland, Angleterre to the French. And he wrote back and goes, "That's a really interesting interpretation. Can't stand British Israelites. Anyone who brings up this nonsense of this, like, that somehow the Irish are one of the 12 tribes of Israel and all this bullshit and all this thing. This is all part of the later mythology that is almost, think of these as sort of like addendums to the Bible to further entrench the mythology of Judeo-Christian within the Celtic world. And they've done in the Slavic world and everywhere else. So where does this leave Christians today? I don't nowhere really. If you still believe in the mythology of Jesus Christ that's sold to you in your Catholic catechism or your Protestant Sunday school, that this guy was all about peace and love, even though his people did nothing but war and murder, and he was himself a racist and a bigot. Uh, if you carry goodness in your heart and that's your sort of like archetypal touchstone, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's actually not a bad thing at all. I think Christianity was served very well by the Reformation. This is one of the problems. This is the primary problem with Islam. There's no possibility of a reformation because the Quran, as it stands, is the final word of God. So all these liberals who think, well, we're going to eventually get a reformation in Islam, and they won't have to deal with that as jihadist anymore. Wrong. Did crusades stop with the Reformation? Tell that to the Native Americans. Tell that to the people in Africa. Didn't stop. Continued on. What manifest destiny is the same thing as jihad and crusade. Same thing. You know, and Cecil Rhodes' conquest of Africa from Cairo to the Cape. That was that was crusade as well. Cape to Cairo, and so on and on and on. But the main reason I'm putting this stuff, I didn't care. I could care what you worship, what you anything. Now, and there's also other things, issues as well. Like there were groups over the years, starting probably with the Gnostics. Now I'm talking about the post-Christian Gnostics, uh, who, and then maybe even the Cathars and the Bogomils, who tried to address this sort of like un-European dynamic within Christianity. Remember, it's a Middle Eastern religion. It's alien to us. And I think one of the ones that were the most interesting were the Theosophists. Oh, again, the truth is on it. Theosophists, oh, evil. I actually have a lot of time for Theosophy because, well, firstly, it's not really like Theosophy and Ariosophy are not really religions. They're more like sort of like philosophical paths. And Theosophy, basically, to its credit, now remember, Lucifer, the devil, and Satan don't really appear in the Bibles, not in any of the original texts. Satan is just a proto Arabic, it might be Aramaic as well, for shaitan, which means the opposer. And if you were a Satanist up until very recently, all that meant was you were like an apostate, like Julian the apostate. You were against the current Christian or the current order of things. You just said, I don't go to mass on Sunday. You're a Satanist. You're an opposer. You don't think that the church should be running people's lives. You're a Satanist. So there was no being such as Satan. And there was no being such as the devil. We're not talking about demons or anything. I'm talking about like in terms of what you're raised in your Christian religion. That's just this French word means for the evil. So the sense of evil, like the archetypal evil. Now, Lucifer is, of course, the fascinating one. Lucifer was a Greco-Roman god, the the god of the planet Venus, the morning star. And Lucifer is one of the most beautiful gods in paganism, known as Phosphorus in Greek. And he spreads enlightenment, a flash of enlightenment, that Luciferian moment, bang, realization. So that's where the word Luke comes. It comes from an Indo-European word called Luke, which is ligni in uh, in uh, in Sanskrit, which also means to speak. And that's where a lot of stuff like I am what I speak, abracadabra. In the beginning was the word, and the ligni and Luke, and that's where Lu comes from. That's where Loki comes from. The flash of light, Lucifer, the Luciferian moment, the realization, the glowing bright light of truth. Now, that was a pagan god represented by the planet Venus that orbited in this interesting orbit, which created around the Earth, which created over the year the pentagram, created a pentagram because of the orbital structure of the two planets. And that's why the pentagram became the symbol of black magic. It's not really a symbol of planet Venus. And that's all nonsense about being upright and inverted. Now there's another phrase, the swastika. The swastika appears on Jewish synagogues in Palestine from the BC era. The swastika was just a symbol of the sun generally, but other things. Swastikas appeared all over Ireland pagan times. And that's another one that, the crucifix was also heavily based on the swastika because it was such a universal symbol when it was adopted by Christianity. Peter Knight's book, Stolen Images, is really good for that stuff. So you had all that, right? So you had when the King James Bible was being drafted, they decided to go back, I guess to their credit, to the original Jewish Hebrew text and translate them. But some of it was badly translated. That's why, like, even Protestants to this day saying, well, we're getting better and better translations all the time. That's why they call it a black Bible, a black Protestant Bible, because there's so much missing because it's so bad. It's either not properly translated or it's translated wrong. And one of the things that the black Protestant Bible translated wrong was Lucifer. They saw a Hebrew term that they mistakenly thought was Lucifer, and it wasn't. And that's how Lucifer ended up in the Bible. That's how he ended up in the Bible. Now, there is the concept of the fallen angels and all that. This is a fascinating stuff. Now, I've gone a long way around, but I'm back to, circling back around to theosophy. The theosophists said, well, within Christianity, there really is no light and shade. You know what I mean? So, for instance, like in many other religions, there are, even including Judaism, not in Islam, unfortunately, because that's like one of its problems. But the general, you say like in most religions, the concept of the malediction and the benediction, right? Used that way. The darkness, the light, and the shade. And the darkness is caused, the brightest light casts the darkest shadow kind of thing. And the light only exists because the shadow exists. So it's the yin and yang thing. And so they try to address that within Western theology. And you had like Alice Bailey and the Lucis Trust and Luciferianism grew out of that. And the concept that when the now it's all allegorical, it's not literal, so don't take it literally. This is how the Theosophists saw it as well. That when in the Protestant Black Protestant Bible, when Jesus was when Lucifer or the angel, the most beloved angel, led the revolt against God, quite rightly, I might add. Um, they were cast down to earth. So ostensibly, Lucifer within theosophy is the king, is the god of the earth, and the god of the great god, which even pagans believe in, that there's a great god, is the god of the rest of the universe. So Lucifer is the god of this planet, And so that's what they talk about, and that made its way into things like Freemasonry and things like that, Rosicrucianism, where that like the year of enlightenment, when men became conscious, and that even made it into Presbyterianism, Protestantism, where Bishop Usher of Armagh dated the earth on the year of Anni Lucius, the year of light. And that was basically saying that was the year that the angel was cast down to earth and man began to think for himself. They also, in the Jewish tradition, that is in Genesis, in Adam and Eve, where the serpent, this is why they all became conflated. The serpent handed Eve the apple, and she handed that to Adam, and they felt the great fall. But it's really this is that's it. In many ways, it's one of my favorite Jewish passages because it says the price for being a dynamic human being is thinking for yourself. Really, when Adam took a bite of the apple, he stopped being an NPC, and Eve was already not an NPC, and that's what the serpent represents, the rising up of enlightenment from below, where man began to think for himself, where the loss of innocence, that's what happened. And there's a price you pay for that because the whole thing is like, ignorance is bliss. That's what it really is about. Which brings us by this massive convoluted thing to where we are now. And where we are now is we have this movement taking over America in the conservative world that's restoring America away from wokeism, critical theory, neo Marxism, and political correctness, and back towards conservatism. And not surprisingly, because a lot of it takes part, America's predominantly a Protestant country anyway, it's going back to Christianity. Now, is is that a bad thing? No, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think it's a good thing in many ways. And but there we like, one of the reasons it fell in the past is because it didn't. There's a lot of lies being told. Like the founding fathers of America were Christian. They absolutely were not. Many of them wrote open letters, openly hostile to Christianity. And if anything, they were kind of neo-pagans, atheists, and they would have been more, seeing themselves more sort of sympathetic towards Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius, and even when the stuff they'd invoke from Europe, like the Enlightenment, the philosophical Enlightenment, that was very European as well, very European, very. And then you had like other influences on that, such as like Swedenborg, which is really amazing stuff. It really is amazing stuff. I really enjoy Swedenborg's writings, as I do J.R.R. Tolkien, and even to a good degree C.S. Lewis. So even me as a pagan, I'm willing to dive into that Christian world to find inspiration. So that's what the show is about today. When you hear Tucker Carlson, and who, he admits that he's learning. He admits that fair enough, that's cool, no problem. But when someone like who presents himself as an intellectual, such as Jordan Peterson, who claims that there is no European civilization, that we're just all you're white, you don't have any culture. That's really what he was saying. It all came from the Middle East, and it's bollocks, and he's full of shit, and he should be called out as that. And that's probably the main reason I made this video was seeing him say that when he wasn't crying. Don't don't just if you don't believe something just because Jordan Peterson said it. So if I haven't offended enough of you, that I'm sorry. Uh, Maybe you should listen harder. If I have offended you, I'm sorry. I wasn't meant to hurt. I'm not here to hurt people's feelings. I'm just here to address a balance because we pagans have paid a terrible price ever since the creation of the mythical Jesus Christ character. And in some ways we're still paying a price. We're not basically being stoned to death or being force converted. But when you see Jordan Peterson make a statement like that, he's mocking our pagan ancestors, which, dear Christians, are your ancestors too. Sanguine gnosis.